Good. That's it.
We're live?
We are mega live
Mega live. There we go. Hey, welcome back. Welcome to a table for 7 billion.
and
Um,
growing.
and growing, yeah. Well, a couple people died, so it balances out. Um,
Yes.
yeah, so here we are. We're back for another podcast. I had some venison the other night at a barbecue. It was really good. It wasn't very gamey because I think it was farm raised in New Zealand, of all places.
That's crazy
Uh,
because I was wondering. That's the first thing I ask you because my grandmother used to make it and she had to marinate it
yeah,
for a couple of days before you could even touch it.
yeah. Well, the only venison I'm used to eating is when deer come into my yard. Um, but we haven't had any deer for a while, so
Oh
I
dear,
missed it.
dear.
Yeah, I've had to settle for raccoon, which is very gamey.
Raccoon burger. Once you remove the hair, it's fine. You
Yeah,
have to.
and it makes a really great hat too, so I like them.
And shoes.
Yeah, so so we're going to talk about beer today. America's favorite alcoholic beverage. Did you know that? It is the
No,
number one alcoholic beverage in America. Probably in most other countries too. Well,
really? Okay, that's cool. I love
probably
beer.
probably not in big wine producing countries, but here beer is number one and it has been for a very, very long
Wow.
time.
That is crazy. No, I didn't know, I'm kind of glad. I love beer. I love specifically the American beers, the craft beer.
Yeah.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's pretty crazy, amazing.
It's very interesting. Gosh, in America there was a time when every town certainly, but in big cities, almost every neighborhood had a local bar that served its own brand of beer. I mean, there were
Right, right.
breweries everywhere. They didn't brew at the bars, but there were lots of little breweries in New York. There were dozens of them, um, and of course, they all vanished during Prohibition because they couldn't
Ah,
survive.
right.
Some of them, the bigger ones, the ones that had either money or were very clever, survived. Do you know what some breweries did during Prohibition? They switched over to making ice cream. There's a very famous brewery in Pennsylvania, and they just started making ice cream because it's a lot of the
Amazing.
same equipment, and it's very interesting.
Oh, wow.
Budweiser,
What do you mean?
Anheuser,
So,
huh?
what do you mean same equipment?
Well, they have big
So-
vats and they
Oh, yeah,
have
okay.
stuff, and so they would just start making ice cream. Uh, then a lot of breweries were able to produce a certain amount for what they called either medicinal or for religious purposes. So they could produce, for example, there were people that could produce wine that was strictly for communion in churches, and they could produce small amounts of beer for um, all but very, very small quantities. They couldn't do big quantities. It was even okay to brew at home as long as you only brewed
Well,
for yourself.
yeah, right,
And Anheuser-Busch in St. Louis, they were very clever. They converted over to making a very, very popular soft drink. Um, and they sold that throughout Prohibition, and it kept them alive, basically. I think they also brewed small amounts of beer for minimal consumption, but the soda is what really did it, and they had a logo. It was a fox. I can't remember the name of the beer or the soda, but it had a fox on the label. And if you visit the Anheuser-Busch campus in St. Louis, there's a building
wow,
that still has a relief
wow.
of this fox on the side of the building because it
Mm.
basically kept them alive. So only about five major breweries survived Prohibition because they were able to,
Oh,
sustain
yeah.
themselves. They had enough money and they did other things to get through. And then when Prohibition ended, they just cranked up again and started producing. And because
Wow.
all these smaller breweries were gone, those five breweries just dominated the market. There was Miller and
Yeah,
Anheuser-Busch are still the biggest, but there was
just,
also
yeah.
Pabst and uh, Hams, and there are a number of them.
But
Um,
are they still here today?
some of them are. I mean, Anheuser Busch certainly is, but
No, no, I know.
Budweiser's
Yeah.
biggest selling beer in the world.
Wow.
followed by Miller High Life, and both of those companies also produce a number of other beers, and they also import beers. So there's a lot of stuff, but
Okay.
the soft drink is still known as Budweiser. Do I detect sarcasm?
Oh, I have a good joke about beer, man. When you're ready, I just
Okay.
remembered.
Um, so, but the problem was all those main breweries, they were all based on German um, lager style beers, and so that became the dominant beer in America, and to this day, really, I mean, it still probably outsells all the craft brews.
Wow.
And so for many years, for decades, the only beer you could really get was these very light, crisp lager style beers like Budweiser and Miller and Pabst Blue Ribbon. There's nothing wrong with them per se. It's just that it's all the same. So it
I
kind of
don't. I don't.
it,
I think they're
it
disgusting. I mean, seriously.
well, I mean, some people love them. Some people like
I
them
know,
because
but
they're real
it's.
clean and fresh and they don't have a lot of flavor and they
Oh,
you
come
can
on, man.
drink a
It's
lot of
not.
it.
I can't
But
see. This is something I would. It's very poorly made. It's mostly made with corn syrup. It's not healthy at all. It's
yeah,
really like as opposite to a good beer, James, which is actually pretty healthy. I mean, unless you drink tons of it. It has fermented product. There's lots of stuff
yeah.
in there. You can't put corn syrup in a beer or everywhere, man. That's like anyway. Sorry, that's
Yeah,
kind of
it's
like
you're right, but I mean, look at how many people drink soda every day,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
they drink can after can after can of soda, and that's just terrible stuff. I mean, they'd be better off drinking beer, even cheap beer. So
By
anyway,
the way,
that lasted until the 70s when or late 60s 70s when a few and really the whole thing the craft thing came about because of Fritz Maytag.
what's that?
He he was the heir to the Maytag fortune, one of the
Oh,
heirs. He had come
wow.
from Iowa where they made, washing machines and he
Oh, wow. That company. Dang.
yeah, and he lived in San Francisco and he was an independent, he was sort of an entrepreneur and he bought this old brewery called Anchor Steam and bought it with the intention of starting it up again and producing really good craft beer, and that's what he did. And initially it just sold in the local area. In fact, when he first started doing it, he had these wagons, horse-drawn wagons, that he would deliver the beer to the different pubs just to be traditional. But of course
Wow.
it grew and it started selling outside of San Francisco, and now it's sold everywhere. So now
Uncle,
it's a big,
I love Uncle Steam.
yeah, it's really good beer, and
Love that beer. Oh my God,
it's a
that's one of the
particular
first.
style. It's a
Yeah, right.
particular method
It
of making the beer.
has a spice to it. I
Yeah.
discovered that when I first came here, and I fell in love, and I love
Well,
this beer. Yeah.
that's really what kicked off the whole microbrewer industry, and then a
Wow.
lot of others followed. Many of them didn't survive, but some of them did. Like you got what's the one up in Chico?
There's
I'm
so many.
blanking on
Sierra Nevada, no.
Sierra Nevada, and many others.
That
And
was good
then
too.
yeah, it's very
Those are
good.
good
And
beers. Yeah, wow.
now there's probably hundreds of them around the country. They're literally everywhere in the country. There are microbreweries
But this is
or
better
or
to
brew
drink.
pubs too.
This is good. We've never invited a beer maker here on this show, right?
No, no, they're they're
Let's
drunken
let's
they're
let's keep
drunken
it this way.
lots.
Let's keep it this way.
Yeah, we'll get a brewer. We'll have to find a
You
brewer to
guys,
have on the
by
show.
the way, if you're wondering what I'm doing, I'm getting ready for a class, and at 2 o'clock, so I have to be ready. But what I did, James, is I forgot that cheese, which is a Conte, right? I forgot it in the fridge for like I don't know a year or something. It was in the back,
Oh,
and now it's super hard, right?
so
So
you
I'm
were
just gonna
aging
grate
it.
it, right? But so people understand, this is super hard like a rock, just like Parmesan, right?
Yeah.
So I'm gonna use it like Parmesan. So when you have an old piece of cheese like this, just it's not gonna go bad. It's just super hard. It's like a rock. But now I'm gonna go and I'm gonna grate it. So I have a really good grated cheese that I'm gonna use for something. I'm gonna make a gratin, a cabbage gratin.
Oh, cool.
So I have all this stuff that I'm gonna make a gratin with cream. Look at this, all this good stuff.
Very nice.
Ooh, anyway, that's for later. That's not for you guys.
So I want to go
Someday.
back. I want to go back a little bit in the history of beer. I want to go back to the beginning because, according to what I've read, the earliest beers were brewed by and probably invented by the ancient Sumerians.
And not
Um,
not to confuse with the modern Sumerian, right?
yeah, we're still looking for the modern Sumerians. And it was really the advent of beer, and then the Egyptians. Other civilizations followed. The Egyptians were the first one to brew beer commercially. But it's such an interesting food because, and I call it a food because it is basically liquid
Yeah,
bread,
right.
and
Right.
it is, and it was considered, part of a daily diet in for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years because water. We've discussed this before on the show. In
Yeah,
most
yeah.
places around the world, water was not safe to drink, or it was very iffy at best. So beer was
It's
much safer.
and lighter. It was lighter in alcohol also. It was like 3% or something.
Right. Well,
It's
you could
yeah,
brew it at different levels, and
yeah.
there are documents from the early days in England where they would brew beer for the whole family. So they would brew a very very low alcohol beer for the children, and then a little bit higher for like to drink through the day, and then maybe a higher alcohol one to have at night. Um, and it's also probably how civilization came to be. And when I say civilization, I mean the establishment
Right,
of
right.
communities instead of a nomadic existence because they had to settle down to grow the grain.
Yep.
Um,
Well, that's
and
the yeah.
so between bread and beer, that's how they started forming communities because they had to grow this crop. They grew wheat and they grew barley. Um, and the yeast, of course, if you put barley in water and you let it soak for a while, and this is probably how they discovered it, the wild yeast will get into it and it will transform the sugars into alcohol and carbon dioxide, and boom, you have beer.
All
So
right.
I'm sure it was discovered by accident, and then over time they refined the process. But what's really interesting, and I didn't know this, but what's really interesting about beer and barley is that when you turn barley into beer, in other words, once these active yeasts get in there and do their job, it actually quadruples the vitamins and minerals in barley. In other words, it makes barley way way more nutritious than if you just
Yep.
eat barley by itself.
And this is what's up in just to make a quick note. And we talked about that before, of course, but we're gonna repeat stuff over and over. It's basically the microbes that made us who we are today. We were able to use microbes to generate to eat food that was not edible, like all the grains, the cabbage, the beer making alcohol, the salami, making protein. You
Right.
can keep it. Cheese, making the cheese available to drink through, milk through cheese. So yes, microbes have been very important in our evolution.
I owe everything to microbes. In fact, if I ever win an award and have to give a speech, I'm just going to thank microbes. I'm just going to say
I'm
I'd like
gonna,
to
I'm
thank
gonna,
all
th-
the microbes.
I'm gonna thank your crobes.
Well, also the wild yeasts also add more vitamins and protein to the mix, so it makes the vitamins and minerals in barley better and
Uh,
stronger, and then it
yep,
also adds more. So
beautiful. Huh?
it's
Yeah.
just a really nutritious drink. Now the ancients, of course, didn't understand about yeasts and microbes and germs and stuff, but what they did know was that when they drank beer, when beer was part of their diet, it made them healthy and it made them feel good, and that's all they needed to know, that
Right, right,
it
right,
kept them healthy. This was at a time where food was harder to come
right.
by, and if you had
You know
beer,
how
you could stay healthy.
it started on the opposite though. It started by you drink it and you don't die. That was the first step. Then
Right,
it makes you healthy, right? You know what I mean? It's
right,
like they keep trying stuff. What didn't kill them right away, and they see
right,
how further they can go. Yeah, absolutely.
right. And of course, we've talked about this too, but the earliest brewers were all women.
Yep.
and they were
I mean,
considered
maybe
to
not.
be,
Okay, let's not say all, but
well,
most.
not all,
Okay.
but
Good.
it was
Yeah.
considered a woman's job, and the women were kind of considered like divinely inspired from the goddesses to do this. They were, you know, it was all about the gods and goddesses, and there was a goddess who ruled over, you know, wheat and barley and and agriculture, cereal grains, you know, Ceres in Rome and Isis in Egypt. um, and so because it was a goddess, it came down to women. And in fact, originally there were priestesses who would prepare the barley, and they would prepare it by actually chewing the barley before it got added to the
Oh, yeah.
water, because the enzymes would do something. And then they also added herbs and spices and all kinds of things. um, they used to also soak, sometimes they would just soak barley bread in water, and then after they'd soaked it for a while, they would strain it off and they would put it in sealed clay containers sealed with mud, and then they would just age it for a while. And
Right.
it was a very crude form of beer, but they were experimenting. They just kept doing this, kept adding ingredients, kept making it different ways, and
So
began to
since
understand how it worked.
can you talk a little bit then difference between cider and beer then? I mean, I know you're going to talk about different beers, but what's so because cider was discovered just naturally, just by leaving the apples, the
Right.
juice ferment, and then that's
Same
it.
thing. I mean,
Right.
it's the same yeast, it's the same bacteria that does it, and it was probably discovered in exactly the same way. It's
Right.
just that in places like, say, Normandy in France, they didn't grow barley and wheat, they grew apples. So they would, you know, press the
Well,
apples and it would turn to cider. It'll do it naturally. Of course, nowadays we control it more.
right,
We
right.
use cultures that are developed in a
Yeah,
laboratory,
yeah.
and so we just have a lot more control over beer and cider and all those things now, and wine and anything that's a naturally fermented substance. We know more, so we can control it more. But all of it'll happen naturally if you leave it out. Which is, again, how it all got discovered. I'm sure that's how wine got discovered.
Isn't it?
Um,
Isn't it? Isn't it Carlsberg who actually was able to pasteurize beer the first time from
Pasteur, yeah, yeah.
no, Carlsberg,
Carlsberg? Oh, I don't know that.
the beer. Yeah, it was the first one who was able to stabilize the beer, and yeah, I think
Oh,
it's
interesting.
it was that it's in what Deutschland or where is Carlsberg? It's north.
Is that a Danish beer, or is that a
It's something like this. Anyway, so no,
yeah.
Pasteur discovered pasteurization, which is, you can apply it to many, many different stuff. But I think beer was developed by Carlsberg because I think he was contracted to find a way to preserve beer, and they made it, and then he made his beer. Anyway,
And it changed the brewing industry. It meant that
right.
no longer did you have to consume beer right away fresh. You could actually then you could start putting it in a bottle, and you could produce larger quantities. Because in America, it was very common for people to take a pail to the local brewery, or to the local pub rather, and get a bucket of beer and take it home for your consumption, and you
Uh,
drink that for a day or so, and you'd go back and get more. And when once they figured out how to stabilize it, so you could make it, stabilize it, then you could put it in a bottle, you could put it in cans, and you didn't have to buy it. Oh, right, Czech Republic, of course, the Czech Republic.
yeah.
Right. Thank goodness we have Kenny doing our fact checking for us. Because otherwise, otherwise, Kenny, we just make it up. So there were alewives throughout Europe that
Isn't the
made the
Czech
beer.
Republic? Uh,
Yeah, yeah, Czech Republic. Yeah, same place. I think Pilsner
it's
comes from too.
I don't think that the origin is right because I remember reading Denmark. It was started in Denmark. It's this is yeah. That's how it started in Denmark, and Then I don't know. He must have been bought out by Czech Republic. The Czech Republic is the other Budweiser. And when we were
Right.
back, I had a Tex-Mex in Paris for a long time. And when we had Budweiser, they had to change the name to Bud. They could
Yeah.
not use Budweiser any longer. So had the Budweiser at the beginning, and then it changed because Budweiser, the Czech, the real Budweiser, is different than the American Bud. So it's
Oh
weird, huh?
yeah.
But
Well,
Carlsberg was
that's
Denmark.
where it originated. That's what they named it for. And of course, once Budweiser, they were so much bigger that the people in the real Budweiser producers couldn't possibly um, fight Anheuser-Busch,
Yeah,
so they had to
but
change the name. Here, it
yeah,
in
in
Czech
Europe,
Republic, it's still called Budweiser, and I think in Europe
exactly.
it's still called.
And you know what? After that, in my bar, I actually bought that beer. That was actually pretty good.
Yeah,
It was a
it's
real beer,
good,
right?
good lager beer.
Yeah. Anyway.
Yep. So then, of course, the brewing guilds began, and those were mostly run by the bishops, and they did away with women. They gave it, it became more of a male-dominated thing, and
Right.
and it's been male-dominated ever since until recently. And I think there are women involved in craft brewing today. I don't think it's there's a lot of them, but there are some. And then, like I said, the German immigrants in the 19th century, they brought their beer making techniques with them, which was all these lighter lager style beers, which has
Oh,
come to dominate the industry. Um,
because
Milwaukee,
I know that, for example, so women were the master beer at the beginning, right? But then it
right?
was slaves. The slaves were making the home chores, and so the slaves were making food, beer, wine, whatever it is, right? That was
Sure.
their job. So it became mixed after by basically having all these people, and this is why you can see in the Mediterranean you have kind of a one big recipe style, right? It's olive oil,
Hmm.
parsley. It's kind of a because the slaves were exchanging recipes. They were the one cooking in the households.
Oh,
So I
that's
think
interesting.
slaves have a very important role in all this because slaves exist forever, right? It's one of the oldest. I mean, in the Roman Empire, you become a slave if you have debts for the time being until you pay your debt. Like you become a slave, and that's
Right.
the law. So
Well, and also,
slavery.
anytime you conquered somebody, you would
Oh,
you
that's
would
yeah, of
take
course.
take people home as slaves
That
to,
of course that's the base. But also, even if you don't have a war, that's what I'm saying.
yeah,
Slavery is very common for anybody. And in Roman, I'm sure it's in other places, but in Roman, if you can't pay your debts, you become a slave, and that's it
yeah.
for the time. Whatever it's crazy, huh? So yes,
Well, it's still true. If you get deep in debt today, you're a slave to your debt. I mean, you just
right,
have to
right,
work.
right.
You can't. It takes away a lot of your freedom because you have to meet that debt every month. It's
I know,
terrible,
right?
terrible thing,
Yeah.
terrible thing. Um,
Oh, well,
so what are the differences?
yes, please.
So lager comes from the German. It's from the German term to store. um, and it was always brewed at cold temperatures. It is brewed at cold temperatures, and when you brew
Ah,
at cold temperatures, the yeasts settle to the bottom. So it's called a
okay.
bottom fermented beer,
Okay.
and they tend to be, and they're ready. They're it takes 4 or more weeks to get it ready, which is why it's to store, because you have to store it in a cold warehouse for a few weeks before it's palatable. And this type of beer is, as everyone knows, it's relatively clear, it's crisp, it's clean tasting, it's meant to be drunk cold. um
What do you mean
People,
cold? Like in opposite to room temperature, or
yeah, it's
what do
it's
you mean?
meant it's meant to be cold, colder than a cellar temperature. So
Oh, okay, okay, okay.
um, the advent of refrigeration was a big deal back in the very, very late 19th century, because suddenly they could make these beers and keep them longer because they could put them in the refrigerator. People talk about going to England and drinking warm beer.
I know.
Um, and it's actually cellar temperature beer, but it's a different kind of beer too. They drink
Well,
ales in England.
in France, it's a joke, of course, but they were saying, the difference between uh, French food and English food. That was
Yeah,
in the old days when English food was terrible. Now it's better. It's if it's warm, it's beer. If it's cold, it's soup in
yeah,
England.
yeah. So ales are different. Those are uh, they're fermented by wild yeasts that are similar to the ones you find in wine and yogurt. So it's a different kind
Oh
of
wow.
yeast than lager. And they brew them at warmer temperatures. So when they do that, the yeast floats on the top of the vat,
Okay.
so they call them top fermenting beers. And they tend to be much fruitier. They tend to be much more complex, heavier tasting, and they're ready in a matter of days. When they
Right.
make ale, it's ready pretty fast. Lagers have to sit for a few weeks in a cold storage to to they have to age slightly, which seems like it'd be the opposite because lagers are so light and fresh.
Yeah,
You'd think that those
I
would be
know.
faster, but it's the opposite.
Wow.
So,
Guys, if I'm
um,
crying, it's not because James is boring. It's really
oh
the onions.
yeah.
I'm cutting a bunch of onions, man. Wow.
Don't you have your minions in class to do that for you? You're getting it all ready for them?
No, this is a virtual class. I have to do everything.
Oh, I see.
It's a
Oh,
virtual
right,
class
of
at 2, like
course.
right at 2. So it's gonna be right. It's okay. It's good. I do a lot
Yeah,
of virtual, actually, pretty cool, because then the companies or businesses can just, have a word. Because lots of people still work in their house, right? It's still
right,
something that is not gonna go away, right?
right.
And they need to greet. So we do a lot of stuff like happy hour, fun meetings, and a little bit of cooking and fun, whatever. It's really cool.
Oh,
I
nice,
do a lot of I
nice.
do a lot of those. All right. Anyway,
So
so lager. Okay, we got that. So lager.
lagers are light, clean, fresh. They're bottom fermented. Ales are more complex, fruitier. They're top fermented. They're brewed at a higher temperature. Lagers are brewed at a cold temperature. Um, What does that say, Kenny? Is lager always cerveceae? What the heck is that?
Well, Servicia is the Celtic name,
Oh, is that where cerveza comes from in Spanish, I guess?
probably.
It's
Probably.
probably all from Latin,
No,
huh?
Latin and Celtic or Greek are different, even
Yeah, no, I
though
know
a
that.
lot of the origin are the same. I think it's no, I think it's different. What do I know? Huh? How do
I don't know the
you,
answer to your question, Kenny. I
Kenny?
don't
You're
know that.
breaking out. Kenny, you're breaking out.
So you'd think that lagers would be popular in any colder climate, but they're not. They tend to drink ales, which are heavier and more complex. The strain of yeast that is used for wine and beer commercially. Oh, is that what it is? Uh, I don't know. I don't know. That's an interesting question. We'll have to research that.
Well,
So,
James, you didn't do. Yeah, go.
so I
I
think
really want to.
beer is
Sure.
great with food.
Sorry, James. I keep cutting you off.
That's all right. What were you gonna
No,
say?
I just want to know the end. I'm so like excited. I want to know the end of the story. I want to know how it ends. Does it end well? What's the deal?
So,
Beer.
wine famously goes well with food, but beer is great. The thing about beer that's so great with food, especially things like cheese and sausage and things like that is that the bubbles actually kind of explode the flavors in your mouth. And a
Yeah,
good
right.
little illustration of this is to get a nice piece of brie, any soft ripened cheese, and take a bite of the cheese, and then take a sip of whatever beer you like, or take a sip of beer first, then eat some brie, have a little bit more beer, and just see what it does in your mouth. The flavor
Oh,
of the
wow.
cheese just so if you taste the cheese first and then you taste it with beer, the flavor is so much bigger. It just, like I said, it just kind of blows up in your mouth. So
So that must
it,
be the same with champagne then,
champagne
right?
also, right? That's why
I mean,
champagne
why
goes
not?
so well with food. Wine goes well with food for other reasons,
Right.
but anything bubbly is really going to accentuate the texture and the flavor of the food that you're eating. And there's some foods, of course, that just go so much better with beer than with wine, like hot, spicy food. Um, I really like, any kind of German food, those heavy, those
Oh, I
sausages,
know. Oh my God,
that
German
all
food
those
is so
pork
heavy.
dishes and all that stuff goes really well with
The
beer
cream
because
and the
it's
flour they put it. It's not the pork or whatever. It's the mashed potato, and then they cook that pork in flour. I mean, my God,
right.
it's like
Yeah,
Jesus. You
yeah.
guys, come on.
It's funny
Super
because
heavy.
I've spent a lot of time in Germany on business, and
Right.
I've come to find out that people think that German food is, super, super heavy because of those kinds of dishes.
Yeah.
But actually, they say that the Germans are some of the most fit people in Europe because they tend to eat their big meal in the middle of the day. They eat very light
Hmm.
at night,
Oh, really?
and they don't eat that kind of stuff every day.
Right.
Germans, the whole big, traditional German food with lots of
All right.
ham hocks and stuff. It's not an everyday food. They tend to eat lighter than that most of the
Okay.
time. So I don't know if that's true or not, but most of the Germans I know are pretty healthy, and partly attributable to beer. I'm sure beer is
So
good food.
beer is
It's
not
very
bad.
nutritious.
Beer is not
No,
bad. It has a lot of good properties. It relaxes you. It's like a good alcohol, right? And
right?
alcohol in general is not bad.
No,
Only if you drink a little bit too much. And if you drink a little bit of alcohol, it's not bad at all. Okay, it has a lot of benefits. So I think
it's
people
really
should.
good for you. It reduces stress, and then of course there's all the nutritive qualities of wine and beer that are really good for you. There's the famous French paradox, which were studies they did in the southwest of France, where they eat a lot of duck and goose fat, and
Oh
they eat a
yeah,
lot
yeah.
of it. They eat a lot of it. They eat a lot of foie gras. They use goose fat to cook in. Um, the foods tend to be a little heavier, like
My
uh,
eyes are killing me, man.
what's the famous duck and bean cassoulet.
Oh, the
But
cassoulet. Oh my God. We need to do one. We need to make one.
yeah,
Oh yeah. It
um,
takes a long time, but we could start it you know what we could do? We could start the cassoulet on the show.
start it on the show and then finish
I
it.
guess, right? I mean, it cooks for
Yeah.
4 hours. Sorry, guys, I'm crying because of my onions, because I just realized I don't have enough onions. So it makes me really sad.
Did those onions insult you?
Wow,
Anyway, the
man.
studies they did showed that these people in the southwest of France had an incredibly low incidence of heart disease and and other things that tend to plague industrialized nations, and they couldn't figure it out. And then somebody finally figured out that they thought it was the wine, that they drank a lot of red wine, so it helps
No, it's
counteract
not that.
all that
It's
fat.
not. It's
And
not
I
that.
I I never believed it for a minute. I think it's everything. I think it's their
Yes,
lifestyle.
it's also the fact that you have to understand they eat a lot of saturated fat, right? The
Right.
duck fat and stuff like that. This is what protects your heart. And I know people are confused with that, and that's their problem. I don't care anymore. I mean, seriously, like I've had so many people already getting better. The people that don't, it doesn't. I don't. It doesn't matter, right? But I can tell you something for sure. Saturated fat is extremely important for your body, and this is the fat that you need in order to keep your heart and everything else healthy. If you want to go with seed oil and all the crazy stuff, then go for it. But this is that's what I know, and this is why you're gonna see some weird stuff like the Mediterranean diet. Uh, we eat meat and fat and rillette and saucisson and pate and stuff like that, and we eat vegetables and garlic and olive oil, and we relax and we have our friends around. That's how it works. It's not just the diet like a pill. This is not a pill.
Yeah.
It's a general stuff, right? So saturated fat like goose fat and stuff is extremely beneficial for your heart. That's how your heart becomes strong. And
It's
the
really
cardiologists are gonna say, no, don't eat that, and they don't. Oh my God, it's just like
well, people have been brainwashed, and some people have apparently people have somehow profit from convincing people to eat
well, yeah,
low
because
fat foods.
they sell oil that are cheap and easy to make, and you can make lots of money.
Yeah.
And making butter is expensive to make. You see, that's the thing. All these natural food that we used to eat are expensive
Yep.
because it takes time. It's really good for you, but the cheap stuff is not good for you, and it's cheap
Yeah.
anyway.
So,
So beer
what was I
times.
saying?
You were
So yeah,
saying that,
and but wine is part of that too. Wine and beer is all part of that. Wine probably more so in the Mediterranean. The further you get
yeah,
away from the Mediterranean, it becomes more of a beer culture because the climates get colder,
mm,
um, and it's easier to grow. And you also get into areas where they grow more barley and wheat, whereas the Mediterranean,
yeah,
it's not really known for that. It's mostly they
hmm
grow a lot of olives, they grow grapes, and you know they they grow goats. But you get up into England, Germany, the north, even the north of France. I mean, there's a lot of land that can be used to grow these cereal grains that are perfect for making beer and bread. So, but it's all good stuff. It's all good for you, and it's also, I was at conferences where they talked about the Mediterranean diet and they talked
I know.
about these studies and everything and what they eat, and I added my 2 cents, and I said, you're you're completely ignoring the lifestyle of these people. I mean,
Right.
uh like
I mean,
these Greeks that they studied in the early 60s that they based the whole Mediterranean diet on. I said these guys had very, very low stress. I mean, they were, the hell, the women were doing most of the work, and they were hanging out and,
drinking
watching their
ouzo.
goats. Yeah, they were watching their goats and they were watching their olive trees grow.
Oh, I know.
They had very low
It's a whole
stress,
different lifestyle. Very
and they
different
had a lot
lifestyle.
of exercise. I mean, they had to hike up these hills every day to get to where the goats were, and they worked hard and
You don't
played
have to,
hard.
you don't have to go to the Mediterranean to see healthy people. I bet you a lot of people in the US are super healthy when you start to go into the farms and the middle.
Oh
I'm not
yeah,
talking I'm not talking in the middle America where they eat only fast food. I'm talking about the people that are actually live from the farm, right? Those
yeah,
people are super healthy, super healthy. And this is
yeah.
what we need to look for, this type of behavior, right?
Well, yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, so
So, hey James, is that a day off today? It's a big. Why do people
today
say
is
it's a?
a holiday. It's in Berkeley. It's Indigenous Peoples Day. It's a holiday that used to be
Oh,
called Columbus Day.
oh, that's today.
Yeah.
That's why it's
So
so
so the
slow here.
schools are
Because I
closed
don't have
today.
with. Ah, the,
It's interesting though. I think Berkeley started the whole Indigenous Peoples Day, and now I think it's grown because I know the president was talking about Indigenous Peoples Day. Um,
wow, cool, huh?
it's
Great.
it's kind of silly to just switch it from Columbus to Indigenous people because I mean Columbus, he gets, he was a brilliant navigator. He found land, although he didn't know where he was. He thought he was in the East Indies, and it turns out he was in, the Americas. Um, but it's funny how we grew up. I grew up in school learning that Columbus discovered America in 1492. He sailed from Spain and he discovered America. And it's just it's just not. He gets a lot of credit for doing something that a lot of people had done before him. A lot of Europeans. I mean,
Hmm.
forget the fact that there
Right,
was there were thriving civilizations here
right.
already that had
Right.
been here for thousands of years. But
Mhm.
also, even in terms of European discovery, the Vikings had been here centuries
Yeah,
before Columbus. The
I know.
Basque fishermen used to routinely sail
Wow.
over, and they would fish off the coast of Newfoundland and off the coast of New
Wow.
England.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, they didn't actually land, but they fished there, and they knew there was a landmass there. The Vikings actually settled. They settled
Yeah.
Iceland.
Right.
Um, and there were lots of people here before Columbus, but he got all the press. He also, was responsible for the deaths of a lot of native people on those
Right.
islands, and not
Right.
not
Right.
not that he necessarily set out to kill them. They just brought diseases, and they
Well,
all kinds of stuff. And of course, they enslaved everybody. The first thing you do, you arrive, you just enslave the native population, because you just in their minds, in the Europeans' mind, these people were savages, and so they were less than human. So we'll just make them
right.
slaves, and they can work for us.
Yep.
It's pretty bad. So anyway, I agree with the idea of not necessarily celebrating Columbus anymore, although the Italians love to celebrate Columbus Day because he was Italian. Um,
I thought he was Spanish, but okay.
no, he's Italian. He was Genoese. He came from Genoa originally, but he sailed from Spain because the Spanish king and queen, Isabella and Ferdinand, are the ones that financed his
Yes,
expedition.
that's what it
So
is.
he
Okay,
did it.
so
He did it
it was a
under the
Spanish it
Spanish
was
flag,
yes, it was a Spanish expedition,
right?
right? Because yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's interesting though, because every school kid in America, or at least when I grew up, knew the date 1492. That
Wow.
that was the year Columbus sailed. But it's an interesting date. It's a kind of ominous date because it's also the year that the last vestige of the Arab occupation of Spain was finally pushed out of Spain. And with them,
Wow.
it also brought about the diaspora of the Jews, because
Mm,
the Jews were thrown out too.
yep.
It was a terrible time,
Yep.
and especially considering what all the great things that the Arab culture brought to Spain that are still
Yep.
there:
Yep.
architecture, language, food, all kinds of things that the Arabs left behind in Spain that are now considered integral
Yep.
to Spanish culture and
Right.
cuisine. But yet, they were the rulers, they were the occupying force. But they occupied Spain for 800 years.
Right. And they were stopped by Charles Martel at Poitiers in
Yeah,
732, so they could not cross. So that was the stop. Charles Martel was the one who stopped
yeah,
the Muslim invasion and pushed them back. And Charles Martel was the grandfather of Charlemagne, grandfather or father of Charlemagne. So he was the
yeah.
one who stopped them at Poitiers, and then they started to rest, and then they stayed another 700 years. And crazy, huh?
And then they started pushing them
Yeah,
back down, and they finally were all
yeah,
in the southern part of Spain, and they pushed them even further. And in Sherry country, uh, the um, the biggest town in Sherry country is called um, uh, Jerez de la
oh yeah,
Frontera,
Jerez. Okay, yeah, yeah.
and it's de la Frontera, and it's named that because it was the last frontier. That was the last place that the
Wow.
Moors occupied. And then in 1492, they were finally pushed out completely. And it was a terrible time in Spain because, especially if you were Jewish or Arab, because the ones that were left behind, they had to
Right,
desperately convince people that
right,
they were Christian. So
yeah,
they
right.
started
Or they
eating
would
ham,
accept.
and yeah, it was a terrible time, and they were persecuted. That was when the Inquisition, and it was a terrible, terrible time. But it was also the year that Columbus sailed down the Guadalquivir and headed
Interesting.
out and sailed to. He was looking for spices in the East Indies, and instead landed in probably what is now Santo Domingo, or
One of the
even
best, one of the best sketch from Louis C.K.
uh-huh.
You're Indian, right? No, you're Indian. You have never seen that sketch?
Yeah. No.
You guys are Indian, right? Oh, you need to. Okay, you have to start. You have to type the Indian with Louis C.K. It's so funny. He's like making fun of the American people, trying
Yeah.
to call them Indian from India. No, you're Indian. No, no, we're not. We're not. like the Indian from India and the Indian
Yeah,
from here. Like,
right, right. And
that's
the
funny.
reason the native population in America were called Indians was because originally, because Columbus thought he had sailed to the
Right.
Indies,
Right.
and so he said, "Oh, this is the Indies, so they must be Indians," and it stuck. It
Right.
stuck for to still
Forever.
to this day.
Forever. Like
I
literally.
mean, a lot of Native Americans call each other Indians. It's just become so pervasive in the
So
language that
strange. I know it's weird, huh?
uh,
Anyway.
anyway.
James, I'm gonna stay
Uh,
5 more minutes. We need to close the show in about 5 minutes. I really have an event to go to do right after, and I need to get set up. It's a good
okay.
time. That it's very it's
So
a
what
day
did we
off
learn
anyway.
today? What did we learn
So
today?
you talk about lager, right?
Yes.
But
Yes.
what other type of beer is there?
Well,
I mean,
basically, all beer
IPA,
is divided between lager and ale.
and what's
So in
IPA?
ales, you also have porters and stouts, and you have Trappist beers from Belgium. There's a
What's an
huge
IPA?
variety of ale, huh?
What's an IPA? What's that?
IPA is an ale, an India Pale Ale.
Well, okay, good, good.
Right. So every kind of beer is either a lager or an ale, and there are several types of lager, um, but there's a huge variety in ales, depending on where they're brewed, how they're brewed, and of course today all kinds of other ingredients are used. Um, so it's a pretty broad spectrum, which means for beer lovers, it's a great time because
Right, right.
you can drink a different kind of beer every night for your
Oh my
entire
God,
life
that's
and probably
great,
never
huh?
repeat yourself.
Wow.
So I tend to like the same kind of beer. I can't tend to like sort of an IPA.
Yeah, me
Uh,
too. I like
I drink
this.
those. I like amber colored ales. I like English beer. I love drinking beer in England.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yes. Right.
I love
That
the
was
pubs in
good.
England.
They make good.
They have
Yep,
such
yep.
great beer, and of course
Yeah.
Guinness,
I forget.
which is very good for
Guinness.
you. Oh, and this is interesting too. A lot of people wonder, like, what makes a dark beer dark and what makes a light beer light. Well, it depends on how you roast the grain. If you take the
Mm.
barley and you roast it a little bit longer, so it's a little darker, you're going to end up with a dark beer. If you roast it less so that it's just sort of a nice sort of golden brown, you're going to have that kind of beer. So it's all about how you process the barley in the first place, because it
All
gets
right.
roasted first before it goes into the vat. You roast it to whatever degree you want, and then it goes into, you put it in water and you cook it, and you add the yeasts, and then eventually you strain it all off. You take all the barley comes out because it's all spent at that point. You've you've extracted everything you need from the barley. It's all in the liquid now, and then that becomes the beer, and you age it or you bottle it or you do whatever. But or or you can take that beer and you can put it through a still and distill it
Mm.
into a spirit, into
Wow.
vodka or gin or whiskey.
Oh wow. Which do you
Yeah.
know any alcohol that's beer origin today?
All spirits originally start as beer. Now, it's not
No.
necessarily a beer you'd want to drink because they're not trying to make beer. They're
It's a
trying to,
juice. It's a
they
type of
call it a wort. They sometimes call it wort, and it's just the basis that you
uh,
then distill, and you distill the essence
yeah,
of that,
right, right, right,
and the first thing that comes off is a
yeah,
clear spirit.
right, right.
And from there you can do all kinds of things. You can add botanicals to it to make gin. You can
Mm.
age it in wood barrels to make whiskey, um, or you can leave it as it is, and it's vodka. So beer is the
James,
basis for all of that.
I
So
need to
you got
go.
to go. We learned
You
we
guys
learned
good?
we
That's
learned that
great.
beer is a good thing. Beer is good for you. Beer is healthy. Um, so is wine. So is cider.
Drink more beer. Drink
Yeah,
more beer.
drink more beer. Don't drink too much. Drink responsibly. And remember what Dean Martin said: if you drink, don't drive. Don't even putt. So we'll leave you with that today. So thanks for joining us.
Thank
We'll
you,
be back
everyone.
next Monday. We've got
Yep.
some exciting things coming up too. We're going to be able to
Ooh.
go remote soon,
Yep, yep.
and we're going to visit some farms. We're going to get some more guests on, and we're going to have a gay old time, as the Flintstones used to say.